Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com, where our mission is to help you accelerate your DFS learning curve and get you over the top, get you over that hump to profitability. For those of you who don't know, my name is Benjamin Ricciardi. I go by Benny, BRich11, Benny R11 at Twitter, and all on daily fantasy sites here. I'm actually here today again with my partner and co-host, Josh Kalachi. Josh, how you doing today, buddy?
Doing well, doing well. Another big slate. We got 15 games tonight. Every single team is playing. It's going to be a lot of fun. You can find me on Twitter and on daily fantasy sites at Josh Kalachi on daily fantasy. I'm at Jay Kalachi. And yeah, just like Benny, we played last night. We're going to play again tonight. We're going to teach you guys some plays. We're going to teach you guys how to do some research. Looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun.
All right, so as we said, we're going to be starting every day by going over some of the stuff from last night and see what worked for us and what didn't work for us. Basically, the big thing for last night for me was pitching. Josh, you want to tell people a little bit about pitching last night and how it did a lot of us in?
Yeah, it was interesting because on opening day it was all about the pitching. We had Kershaw, we had Kluber, David Price. But last night, some of the top plays just kind of faltered a little bit. Matt Latos had -17 on DraftKings, which crushed a lot of people's nights. We had guys like Jesse Hahn, who was just one misplay away from having a great day. A lot of people won the top GPPs with Hahn and with Zach Greinke, who put together a nice little night, but just like always, he got into pitch count trouble, had to come out a little bit early.
Yeah, we had, for those of you who played last night, you realize last night was a very, very low-scoring night. And a big reason for that is no matter who you picked as a pitcher last night, there really weren't any big scores. Greinke, I think, might have been the top guy, but he didn't even really have a great game. Guys like Alex Wood were okay. They were pretty highly owned. There really wasn't much in the pitching staff. 50-50 cash lines last night. I saw some on DraftKings that were, well below 100. I think it was like 88, 89, depending on the size of the tournament you were in. Even the GPP cash lines last night, if you got over 100 last night, there's a good chance you probably took some money home in the GPP, which normally, on normal nights, you probably need a few more points than that. But it also goes back to something that, that you and I had talked about before, is, basically pitching is a big thing here. So we got pitchers. Last night the best pitching combo probably only got you about 32, 33 points right there. There are some nights where you get 35 or 40 out of one of the aces. So on opening day when we had, aces wild all over the place and, every team was throwing their best pitcher, you had a whole bunch of guys that were getting 20, 30 points. I mean, last night, like I said, if you got 30 points out of your pitching last night, I think you had to be pretty happy about it.
Yeah, no question. And in those cash games we were just talking about, the line was about, I was in one that was at like 82 or 83. And I think what happened was a lot of people targeted Latos with the splits, and there wasn't really much options. And when you have a player that's highly owned like Latos was at around 20% in cash games, that kind of takes away 20% of the field. And we'll get into that later, I'm sure. But then you only have to beat that 20%, and then there's just another 30%. You're in the top 50. So that'll draw the line down a lot. Every now and then that'll happen. It's not often a pitcher will get chased in the first inning like Latos did, but if it does happen and you don't have them, your chances are you're going to be in the money.
Yeah, like we were saying, we had some of the 50-50s last night on both DraftKings and even on FanDuel. He was a little bit lower owned, but there were spots where Greinke, even with all the uncertainty about the weather, 70-75% owned in spots, and Jesse Hahn was another one who was 40-50% owned in spots. I mean, there were GPP winning teams on different price points at DraftKings last night that had both of those guys together. And like we said, I mean, neither one of them really put the performance in that we were expecting out of them. But when everybody on the field has them, it really isn't going to make a difference to what goes on sometimes. As for bats, though, there were some good bats last night. There were a lot of guys that you could have had. The Diamondback stack, I think, was the one that went off the most. I saw a couple teams high up in the GPPs with them. Anybody else off the top of your head that did well for you that you were thinking of?
Well, the Dodgers came on late at the end. We talked about before the show with Adrian Gonzalez hitting that home run in the ninth. He had that RBI double. Puig had a double, scored a run, I think, in the seventh inning. So if you had some Dodgers or you had some Diamondbacks in your lineup, that you were well on your way towards the cash. And another thing with the Diamondbacks, like you were saying, is they did win some GPPs. And one of the things we like to look at is to the new players in the industry. Why did they target those giant players? Why did they target Vogelsong? And that's something that we look at with reverse lineup construction, is what it calls. When you go back and look, why did those guys win with targeting Vogelsong? Whether it be Vogelsong gave up a lot of hits last year, gave up a lot of home runs based on different kind of splits. But guys like Jake Lamb, guys like David Peralta, those were the kind of guys, those cheap plays that won people a lot of money last night. But going back to what Benny was saying about the weather last night with the Dodgers having that delay right at the beginning, that's going to happen again tonight. Cincinnati and Pittsburgh has a high likelihood of rain. You have to stay away from that game because for those of you that haven't played yet or just getting into it, if a game's postponed, you're getting a 0, big goose egg, and that'll crush your lineups, especially if it's a pitcher. So be sure to stay away from that game. Keep a head up with the weather, and stay away from the hitters, stay away from the pitchers. And if some other people miss that info and they get zeros, it's just another leg up for you. So you see any other weather issues? I know there's some wind blowing down there for the AL West game.
Yeah, there's on the East Coast tonight too. There's they're saying there's some rain. Basically, the same rain that's moving through Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. They're thinking might that might delay that game a little more towards the beginning of it. They're thinking is going to wind up over on the East Coast later on at night. So let me just take a look here. Like games like the Mets and the Nationals may see a little bit of rain late. Games like the Red Sox, Phillies. Who else do we got over on the East Coast tonight? I think that might be it for the ones that could be affected. Also the White Sox Kansas City Royals game. They're expecting a little bit of rain there. Probably the same system that's moving through Pittsburgh and Cincinnati right now as well. And this is actually another teaching point that I wanted to get out there to you guys when it comes to weather. When you start a starting pitcher, if the starting pitcher is going to start the game and the weather's supposed to come later on in the day after the start, a lot of times if there's a long delay, that guy's not going to come back into the game. So if you start a guy and he goes 4 innings or 5 innings or 6 innings, and the weather comes and there's a half-hour delay, 45-minute delay, I mean, it's the perfect time for a manager to pull that pitcher, and it happens all the time. There are times where you might have a guy throwing a gem through 5 innings, 1 run, couple hits here and there, striking out a batter per inning. And then all of a sudden you get to that point where the rain delay comes, they go and sit in the clubhouse for an hour, and when the game does finally restart and they take the tarp off, you see somebody else warming up in the bullpen. And, for DFS tonight, that could kill your night if a guy only goes 4 or 5 innings, something like that. So you really got to be careful of it. We always say it, that weather is an important thing. You got to look at it. You almost have to be an amateur weatherman to play DFS sometimes. But, it's another one of those things that you really need to make sure you look at before you start building your rosters, because you can't take zeros and you can't take single-digit numbers, and expect to have any chance to win a GPP or to pull in some big money on a day.
And that's one of the big things that we always talk about with the pitcher getting a win, especially in cash games. If there's a rain delay in the 4th inning and you can't pitch to 5th, in baseball you have to pitch 5 innings to qualify for the win, as long as your team holds the lead. So if those guys aren't pitching past the 5th inning and you see that rain delay, you see a guy sitting for an hour and they can't warm back up again or get loose, they're going to bring in that next pitcher, and then you see a reliever getting a win. Could just throw off the entire score. But talking about what we were just saying with the weather, there's also 2 games that have 10-mile-an-hour more winds that are blowing straight out, which you want to target power hitters in those games. And if you see fly ball pitchers, which we'll get into in a little bit, if they're pitching in those games where there's a lot of wind, you might want to stay away from that. We have Texas and Oakland has 10-mile-an-hour wind blowing straight out right now, and same thing with the White Sox and the Royals. So do you have, combined with the wind, another thing you want to look at for pitchers, for hitters, is those Vegas lines. Do you have some stuff for us over there from Vegas?
Oh yeah, I'm a big proponent of the Vegas lines. So that's usually how I start my research every day. For those of you who watched the show yesterday, what we look for here is both pitchers that we want to target and also pitchers that we want to target hitters against. So there's a couple things that actually popped out to me today. The first one is the biggest favorite on the day right now is Anibal Sanchez with Detroit. They get Minnesota again today. He's a -170 favorite. The line on that game is actually a little high, though. It's about 8.5, but I wouldn't let that scare me away, because I think that 8.5 line has a lot more to do with the guy he's going up against, Ricky Nolasco, who has been prone to blow-ups in the past. He's a guy that a lot of GPP players will tell you he's somebody that you might want to look to stack a couple bats against if you're playing GPPs. And he's definitely somebody that, even in your cash games, you want to take a look at the hitters on the other side, maybe try to work one or two of the Detroit bats in today against him, because he does have some games. He's a decent pitcher. He's not horrible, but he is prone sometimes to get blown up for 5 or 6 runs over 4 or 5 innings, and get chased early so they can get into that bullpen, which Minnesota's bullpen's not really anything to write home about for me. The best spot on the day for pitching, in my opinion, is going to be the Mets and the Nationals game. If you look at the Vegas line, it's got the lowest total today at only 6.5. At the moment, Jordan Zimmerman is a minus 133 favorite, so he's actually up a little bit from earlier. He was about minus 120 when it opened. So I guess there's a lot of money coming in Vegas on the Nationals and Zimmerman. I like him basically because the Mets only have about 5 hits so far through the first 2 games. So you throw another pitcher on the mound. I mean, that Washington staff, I don't know, Josh, you can talk a little more about it. That Washington staff is pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, for sure. They have a little bit of resemblance to a few years ago when the Phillies had those 4 aces with Oswald, Halladay, Lee, and Hamels. Well, you look at the national staff. You have Strasburg. You have Zimmerman, who's going to throw today. Gio Gonzalez. They brought Scherzer over from Detroit. They have Doug Fister as their 5-starter. They have guys coming in every day that you want to stay away from in daily fantasy. And one of the things we talk about in baseball is finding that one pitcher to target. You're not going to find it pretty much any day of the week against those Nationals.
Yep. There's a couple other games that I just wanted to mention here with the Vegas lines. A few other interesting things. Obviously, the pitchers that we talked about already are some of the ones that are going to be highly used today. Some of the studs going up on the mound. But there's a couple other guys who you normally wouldn't think would be studs that have the odds pretty much in their favor from Vegas today. Willie Peralta was one that stood out to me in that Milwaukee-Colorado game. That's a minus 142 favorite that he is, and they're expecting about 8 runs in that game. Peralta to me is not that great of a pitcher. I know last year when he was on the mound, he gave up like a 305 batting average to left-handed hitters. Obviously, he was a little bit better against righties, but there's some big left-handed bats in that Colorado order. So even though he's a big favorite today, I think that has a lot more to do with the guy who's going opposite of him, Eddie Butler, who's a young pitcher. He was a top prospect. I don't really know too much about him. He doesn't have a very long track record in MLB. You can take a look at some of his minor league stats, but that stuff doesn't always translate very well. It's a whole different game, whole different caliber of hitter that he's going to be facing today. We also have, who's the other guy that I was looking at? Scott Kazmir. Scott Kazmir is a minus 155 favorite. He's a solid pitcher. He's been up and down. I think he's a little overpriced on some of these sites today. But he's also one of the biggest favorites on the board, pitching in Oakland, and it's a 7-run game that they're expecting out of him there. And the last one, there was one other one that I was looking at too. Oh, Brandon McCarthy. Brandon McCarthy with the Dodgers is a minus 135 favorite right now as well, which is one of the bigger ones on the day. And again, he's not a bad pitcher, but there's nothing spectacular about him. So it's just some things to think about. Basically, a lot of times when you see a guy who's not a great pitcher and he has the odds pretty highly in his favor, it has a lot more to do with the guy who's on the other side of the other side of the mound for the other team. And I think that's pretty much the case in most of those, with maybe the exception of Kazmir and those last couple that we mentioned. But again, like we always say, starting pitching is the big thing to get right and the big thing to make sure you can target against. So let's start talking about some of the starting pitching today. Who's caught your eye so far, Josh?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Brandon McCarthy. He was a big, I guess, just kind of a experiment last year when you talk about when he got traded to the Yankees, started throwing his cutter more, and you saw him just really dominating hitters. I believe he had a ERA below 3 at the end of last year in a division where there's not a lot of pitcher-friendly parks. And that's really saying something. Now he's out in L.A. I actually do like him today against the Padres. McCarthy, when he used that cutter, it really opened up his off-speed stuff. And for those of you that aren't too familiar with the game of baseball, when you have a pitch that comes in hard right on inside right-handed hitters and it breaks away from lefties, or either way, if you can set up those other pitches, it translates to strikeouts, which is what we're looking for in daily fantasy. So I am targeting Brandon McCarthy in addition to 2 other pitchers who actually both just signed extensions. I like Rick Porcello a lot against the Phillies today. The Phillies are towards the bottom of the MLB and hitting towards the end of last year. It's basically the same team with the addition of Odubel Herrera, who's not really lighting up the lamp anywhere. Phillies have a bad lineup. They have a lot of guys that don't walk, a lot of guys that strike out a lot. So it translates well for Porcello, especially against a National League team. He has to face 8 hitters instead of 9, which is a big deal for those guys coming in from interleague. Targeting him is one of the actually lower price pitchers on DraftKings. And I'm looking at him in cash games. And for those of you that want to take a little bit of a flyer, I do like Carlos Carrasco today a lot. It's actually another former Philly when we were talking about that situation with Porcello. But Carrasco induces a lot of ground balls, faces the Astros, who strike out a lot. You're going to see that as a little bit of a pattern this year in daily fantasy. Carrasco actually had a higher strikeout rate than Masahiro Tanaka last year. Those of you know, struck out a lot of batters. Carrasco's doing that, and he can throw 6 or more innings. You can potentially see 10 strikeouts, which could win you a GPP, or especially take you over the line in cash games.
Yeah, that's Carrasco's actually a guy. I'm glad you brought him up because he was one of the guys that I've been trying to fit in everywhere today. Here's some stats for you on Carrasco. His last 3 starts of last year, he went 24 innings over those 3 starts, 31 strikeouts, only gave up 3 runs and 18 walks and hits. So when you break that down, he's basically a guy who went 8 innings pitched. He struck out about 10.5 batters, per game, gave up 1 run, and gave up 6 base runners basically over those 8 innings. Now, when you translate that out into a score for daily fantasy, if he gets the win on top of it, that's a guy who's almost going to get you 40 points on DraftKings. And on, let's see, if you're looking at it 860, you're probably looking about 20, 22 points if he could repeat that on FanDuel. So not that I'm saying that he's going to be able to do that, but again, his last 3 starts of last year, those are the numbers that he put up. He put up 50 DraftKings points, he put up 32 DraftKings points, and then he put up 30 in the other games. So, he is a guy that has some upside, and his price all over the industry seems a little bit depressed to me today. I would have figured they would have had him a little bit higher priced. There are guys who I don't like anywhere near as much as him that are priced much higher than he is today. And like you said, he has a lot of upside. He's definitely a GPP play. Do you think that Carrasco would be safe enough to roll out in cash today?
I think his strikeout potential can do that, especially when you look at the Astros lineup. They have guys like George Springer, who was on pace to strike out over 200 times across 162 games. Chris Carter is a guy that strikes out a lot. They have a couple guys that can get those strikeout numbers up for Carrasco, and even if he can't get the win, even if he can't get past 7 innings, he still has the upside, and I think it's actually safe to say you can play him in cash with the ability that he can just pick up those 2 bonus points on DraftKings and 1 on FanDuel every time he strikes somebody out.
Yeah, I agree. I actually have him at the moment. I actually have him in my cash lineup on DraftKings. Now let's talk about DraftKings for a second, because over there we're going to need 2 pitchers. So if you like a guy like Carrasco, who would you be linking him with? I know the one guy who I've been using a lot, and we actually disagree a little bit on today, is I've been putting Jordan Zimmermann in there with him. I think Zimmerman's he's playing against the Mets, who basically aren't that great of an offense. Like I said before, they have 2 games. That is the lowest total on the day at only 6.5, and it should be a pitcher's duel. Actually, I can see him and DeGrom going back and forth and putting up a couple zeros throughout that game. But I know that you said you actually didn't like him as much today. So who else would you be looking at the starting pitcher to put there with Carrasco in your cash games?
We talked about earlier with Brandon McCarthy and Rick Porcello. I like both of them. If you pair Porcello with a Carlos Carrasco, you actually have a lot more money to spend on hitters, which actually worked yesterday, depending on the complete opposite of the first day. So if you have those money to spend on hitters, obviously we will talk about hitters in a moment, but if you have that money left from spending on Carrasco, from spending on Porcello, and you can get 25, 30 points out of those, you can target guys like, I know Benny likes guys like Buster Posey today. There's always guys like Troy Tulowitzki, Carlos Gonzalez. You can target those guys in the top 5 of the order. And another guy in our that works for RotoCurve with us is Michael Rathburn, who has the experience of pretty much anybody, more than both of us combined, that's for sure. He likes to target guys lineups, and that brings us to our next point. Why would we do that? Why is there a reason that we're not looking at the 6, 7, 8 guys? Do you have any particular reasons why you're targeting those guys in the top 3, especially top 5?
Oh yeah, I mean, I it's definitely something that I look at. When lineups come out, that's one of the first things I look at. You especially should be looking at it if you're looking to get some of those cheap bats into your lineup. I know Rath came out last night at about 6:30. and gave a little update right before the lineup started for everybody. And in his update, he basically said, there are a lot of cheap outfielders today in good lineup spots that you should be looking at. We had Travis Snyder batting third last night in a good splits matchup. We had David Peralta from Arizona who was hitting cleanup. And I mean, these guys were over on FanDuel well below $3,000. I mean, I think Peralta was $26,000, $27,000 over on FanDuel. If you can get a guy like that, if you can get a guy in the top part of the order, for starters, he's got more protection around him when he's up in the top part of the order. So you can't always pitch around guys. You can't always, walk guys and put them on base when you have other good hitters around them. When you get down, especially in the National League, if you're batting in the 8 hole in the National League, you're going to wind up walking a lot because if there's 2 outs and a man on second base, they're just going to walk you and pitch to the pitcher. So if you're in a bad spot in the lineup, it hurts you in multiple ways. You're not going to see the same pitches to hit because you don't have protection in the lineup. There's a very good chance the guys hitting in front of you aren't some of the better hitters or the better on base percentage guys in your team. So you're going to have less chances to get up there with guys in scoring position for you to have a chance to get RBIs. And, on top of it, if you're hitting down in the order, the guys at the top of the order, just by simple math, are going to get an extra at-bat here and there. If you're on a website like DraftKings where it doesn't matter if you strike out, it doesn't matter if you make out, it's all about the positive things you do. Well, if I have a guy who's going to get 5 chances to do something positive and you only have a guy who's going to get 4 chances to do something positive down in the bottom of the order, by default, I'm going to be in a better situation because I'm going to have more chances to score points. And, it's basically as simple as that. Also, at the same point in time, this is why I say looking at lineups is very important. Guys like Peralta, guys like Travis Snyder, they might not have even been on your radar at the beginning of the day. But once the lineups came out and you saw that they were in a good splits matchup and you saw where they were hitting, those become guys that you got to start, at the very least, you got to start thinking about. Because if you can put one of those guys in your lineup who's in a good spot and is at 27, 26, 2,800 on FanDuel or, maybe 32 to 3,400 over on DraftKings, then, like you were saying before, you're going to be able to fit in a Buster Posey. You're going to be able to fit in a Tulowitzki. You're going to be able to fit in those, those stud bats that normally you wouldn't be able to fit in. And, if you can get a couple of those guys in your lineup, you're going to have a lot more upside to it.
Yeah, it goes what Benny said. It's a numbers game, really. If you have guys hitting 7, 8, 9, they might only get 3 at bats, and if they're not getting pitched to, they're walking one of those times, which can get you some points. But it's all about bases, especially on DraftKings. If you're getting a walk, that's 1 base, you get 2 points. But if you get a double, if you get a triple, if you get a home run, that's what you're looking for. You're getting in those double-digit points. It was what Benny talked about yesterday. For those of you that were with us, Matt Carpenter, getting you those 10 points is huge. So if you have hitters that get more opportunity, if you have hitters that are getting protection, as Benny was saying, those guys aren't going to just pitchers aren't going to throw you curveballs in the dirt. If the guy that's facing next is Troy Tulowitzki, is Giancarlo Stanton. If you have a cheap guy that's batting at the top of the order, like you said, like Benny just said, you have to look at him because he has opportunities to not only drive in runs, but he can score runs too. If you're on second base and you have 3, 4, 5 right behind you, you're looking at an opportunity to score at least 1 run during the game. If you get on base twice, that number can just escalate. And in addition to the lineup just being in the top 5, if those guys are cheaper, you don't have to get much more out of them. It just becomes a bonus when they get on base twice, when they get on base 3 times. So if you combine those guys with those cheap pitchers we were just talking about today, you can afford more than one Troy Tulowitzki. You can get a Carlos Gonzalez. You can go look at Carlos Santana, who's eligible behind the plate on DraftKings. It's all about the top 5 in the lineup. It's all about those guys getting opportunities because in daily fantasy, it's all about that, getting those opportunities, getting those fantasy points. And just what are the chances you're going to be able to put up those points if you're only getting 2 at-bats in the bottom of the order? And that's a great point that Rath has made to us many times over the last 2 years is you got to get those guys in the top 5. You're seeing those guys getting more at-bats, getting more opportunities to score runs, drive in runs. That's all you need. It's all about fantasy points, and that's exactly what we're trying to teach you here. You find those guys in the top 5, you're on your way to cash once again.
Yeah, and again, like we said, value comes, is a big deal in daily fantasy, and you're going to get some of those guys up at the top of the order. You're going to see them when the lineups come out, that some of those guys are cheap. When if you're playing on DraftKings, they have those little check marks next to the name once the lineup comes out. If you see a guy you're going to see some guys who might cost $1,000 more that are hitting 5th, 6th, 7th in an order, whereas you could get a guy who's hitting in the 2 or 3 holes sometimes, especially at like a middle infield position. You find guys at like second base, shortstop, third base who are hitting second, first or second in the order up on top. Some guys who even wind up, if you got to find like a second baseman who's hitting cleanup or hitting in the 3rd hole, those are guys who have prime lineup real estate, and there's not many other guys that have them. Especially at you look at a position like shortstop. There's maybe 3 or 4 shortstops in the entire league that hit in the top 4. Most shortstops don't get up in the first inning. There might be a couple guys who are leadoff hitters or something like that, but if you're looking for guys to drive in runs at that position, you basically have Hanley Ramirez, you have Troy Tulowitzki, and then you have a bunch of guys who are either leadoff hitters or hit somewhere around like 6th or 7th in the order, decent. Maybe a guy who has a low batting average and a little bit of pop. So if you can find the guys that are in the better spots in the order, especially if you can find the guys in the better spots at the order that are that are better price-wise for you, it's really going to help you round out those rosters and have money to spend on studs elsewhere. So that's that's definitely our teaching tip for the day for you guys to keep an eye on. But what I wanted to do now, Josh, is let's move on to some of the top hitters on the day. We're going to get into the top hitters on the day, and then come back and give you guys a little bit of information, advice on your game selection, especially now as an early player. Then at the end of the broadcast, Josh and I will get back into who we think are the guys that we're probably going to wind up rostering the most. But let's go position by position for now. Let's start off at catcher. What are your thoughts on catcher tonight, Josh?
I really like Carlos Santana tonight. Actually, looking at my sheet here, I put together one every day on who I'm targeting for the day and who I'm thinking about putting in there. With the money that we spent on pitchers, we have some money left to spend on some top guys, and I do like Santana. He's eligible at catcher still, which is huge on DraftKings. He's one of the first guys one of the only guys that is able to hit in that top 5, like we were just talking about. He faces Scott Feldman today, who gave up a lot of hard hit balls last year. Santana will always going to have the advantage as a switch hitter, so those breaking balls won't be going away from him. He'll have more opportunities to take a ball deep, maybe get a double. And I think that when you target those guys in the Cleveland lineup, especially against a guy like Feldman, it could be a potential stack option, which we'll talk about later. But I'm starting my lineup at catcher with Carlos Santana, and I'm sure Benny can tell you when he talks about his catcher. It's not easy to build around a guy like that, especially when you're looking at value for catcher. The past couple of days there have been guys like Tuppy Gozwich, guys like Rene Rivera. It's hard to find that top-tier catcher that's worth paying for, but I think today it's Carlos Santana against the Astros.
Yep. Well, I actually also have another high-price catcher that I'm using today. I'm sticking with Buster Posey, but before I get into that, I also want to mention to you guys when you're thinking about catchers is a very tough position to roster on the 3rd game of a series, and most of the time what happens is catching is really tough on your knees, so you're not going to have a guy who catches 162 games in a season. Very few of them get anywhere near that number, to be honest with you, anymore. A lot of times what teams do is the first 2 games you'll have your starter out there, depending on the matchup. Sometimes it's a matchup thing, but if you have a guy who 2 days in a row just call it 9 innings behind the plate, a lot of times on that 3rd day, that guy might get the day off. He might get a day of rest. So a lot of the catchers that we're mentioning now, obviously it's still early in the day, so you have to check the lineup to make sure these guys are in. But if Posey is in tonight, Buster Posey is going to be the guy that I put into my lineup again. As Josh was saying, the pitching tonight, you don't have aces on the mound. You don't have $11,000, $12,000 pitchers that you got to try to fit in today. Basically, you're able to get almost any bats that you want if you go, mid to upper tier with your pitching. You're probably still only spending, maybe $8,000 or $9,000 on FanDuel, somewhere around $17,000, $18,000 on DraftKings. So you have some money left over to go up and get guys. Posey gets Jeremy Hellickson tonight, who I've never really been a big fan of. And he's a guy who has what we call reverse splits. Now, reverse splits basically mean, as Josh was explaining yesterday, if you're a right-handed pitcher, most of the time you're going to struggle more against left-handed batters. Right-handed batters is who you should get out easier, in the overall scheme of baseball. But because of certain pitches that guys throw or the way that they work their pitches, some guys will have what they call reverse splits. And Hellickson is one of those guys. Even though he's a right-handed pitcher, right-handed batters actually have a higher batting average over the last 3 years against him. So it's not something that you want to, shy away from just because he's a right-handed pitcher. And on top of it, Posey hits righties and lefties equally as well. So, he's a little bit better against lefties, but, he's still a 290, 295 hitter against right-handed pitching. And on top of it, like we were saying before, just like Santana's in the top 5 of the lineup, Posey's a guy who hits cleanup in that lineup. He's got a bunch of guys in front of him who've been getting on base a little bit. And even though the park is actually a bump for him because they're still in Arizona, they're not home in San Francisco. It's not the greatest hitter's park in the world, but it's a lot better than where he usually plays. So I give Posey a big bump up today too. I have the money left over from the pitching that I would be using to fit a guy like that in today. So if I have the money to pay for Posey, he's a guy that I always want to try to pay up for. Value side, you have anybody you like on the value side that might be a little bit cheaper?
The only other catcher I was really looking at, as I just said, I'm building a lot of my lineups around Carlos Santana. I actually do like the other catcher there in Cleveland, Yan Gomes. You have to make sure that he's playing, as Benny just talked about, which is a great point about catchers on the third day of a series. And you actually have to remember on weekends when there's a lot of day games, a lot of those catchers after catching a night game are going to get the day off. That's when you'll see guys like we've seen in the past with guys like old school catchers like Sal Pisano, guys like Hank Conger might catch this year for the Astros. So the only other value guy I'm targeting today behind the plate is Salvador Perez, who is still one of the better hitting catchers in the game. I know his lineup spot has dropped a lot. He's hit between 6th and 9th. But if his lineup spot is favorable today, he faces a lefty in Jose Quintana. He has the ability to drive the ball into the gaps to get those extra base hits. And that's all you can really ask for out of your catcher. There's not many opportunities for get a guy that can drive the ball into those gaps and get those extra bases. Usually a catcher, you're looking for anywhere to 3 to 5 points on DraftKings. But with Santana and with Perez, you can afford the upside, and it's worth paying for today with those cheaper pitchers. Do you like anybody at first base today?
First base, I rolled Adrian Gonzalez out there last night. He hit a huge home run for me in the 9th inning. It was much needed at the time for a couple of my teams out there. And I was pretty happy with it. He is basically on fire right now to start the season. So he's definitely a guy that I'm going to be looking at. The other guy that I've been looking at a little bit is Adam Lind as well. I like both of them for the same reason. They're both left-handed hitters. They're both facing right-handed pitchers who I'm not really too worried about the pitching that's on the other side against them. Both guys are right in the heart of their order. I think they're both hitting cleanup. That Milwaukee order doesn't look right to me. Cargo doesn't look right. Braun doesn't look right. I mean, they're just not hitting. They got guys that should be hitting, but for some reason right now they're not. The one guy who actually is hitting is Lind. So what I'm hoping is some of these other guys, start getting on base around them, so this way he can drive in some runs. But those are really the two I've been looking at the most. Adrian Gonzalez is the guy that I'm basically been trying to fit in my lineups everywhere. How about you? You got anybody you're interested in at first?
I really like Billy today. The A's have faced some good pitchers in the first 2 days, but today they faced Ross Detweiler for the Texas Rangers. He's another guy that was ousted from that national staff. There's just no room for him. So he's out there in Texas, and he's going to be facing Butler, who is one of the better hitters we've seen over the last 10 years in terms of just pure hitting the ball into the gaps. He's lost some power the past 2 years, but I believe he's hitting 4th for that A's lineup. It hasn't been official yet today. Some of those lineups haven't come out, but you're having him against Detweiler, and Detweiler gave up a batting average over 300 to righties last year. So you're going to target Butler, who's going to get 3 or 4 at-bats at least. Those guys out in Oakland are always walking too, so that's just bonus points. There's guys in front of them that are always getting on base. So if he can get Fold to get on base, if Zobrist gets on base in front of him, Butler could have 2 or 3 at-bats with guys in scoring position. And if he hits a single, if he hits a double, you're going to see that 10 points right away, which Benny talked about yesterday in cash games is exactly what you want on DraftKings.
Yeah, if you can get, and he's another one of those guys where he has a pretty good on-base percentage. He doesn't hit for as much power as you would expect for a guy who hits in the middle of the order, but he's very consistent. He gets hits a lot. He's a very good hitter. He has a very good eye. He works counts. He gets it in. And again, for a cash game, he's a little bit cheaper than a lot of the other options you're going to get at first base. That $1,000 more on DraftKings, $600-700 more on FanDuel. If you can take that savings and get a guy who you're pretty confident is going to get you those points, that's a good thing to plug into your lineups. That'll help you move on. So let's move on to second base. Actually, who do you like in that second base today?
I like the other guy that's hitting right in front of Butler. Actually, Ben Zobrist is a switch hitter, so he's always going to have that favorable split that we just talked about, unless he's facing a guy like Hellickson, which they're very few and far between. But I do like Zobrist. He's been hot so far this year. We just talked about how Detweiler gets hit around a lot by lefties, and in that lineup we just talked about with Fold, with Zobrist getting on base, with Billy Butler behind them. They even have guys batting eighth and ninth that are getting on base. So Zobrist is going to see not even those leadoff guys, not just the second guy in that lineup, but the guys batting ninth are still going to get on base for him. He's going to see opportunities to drive in runs all year long, especially with that A's lineup. And it's only been 2 games so far, but it looks like Billy Beane's still keeping that offense alive. And the 3-hitter in that order is Zobrist, and I'm targeting him every single day until he starts to fall off, which doesn't really look like it's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, it's amazing. The job Billy Beane does over there year in and year out is amazing. I still don't understand. He takes guys that other people don't want and get in that order, and it's amazing. But another guy that I like at second base today, I wanted to get your thoughts on. I'm not a big fan of Aaron Harang, who's going today, so I'm targeting a bunch of Red Sox today. And one of those guys is somebody I know you had on opening day when he went off for a couple home runs, and that's Dustin Pedroia. What are your thoughts on Pedroia today?
I like that guy a lot, just in terms of watching him as a baseball player. He swings as hard as he can almost every time. But hitting in that order, especially with he has got guys like Hanley Ramirez behind him, he's got guys like Mookie Betts in front of him. He's going to have chances to drive in runs. He's going to have chances to score runs. And like you said, facing Aaron Harang, which it seems like he gives up 10 hits every time he pitches. You'll see those games every now and then. He'll give up just 2 earned runs, just 3 earned runs. But he's giving up hits almost every single game. He's not a big strikeout guy, so that saves you a little bit on FanDuel. But having Pedroia in your lineup today, like you just said, we can afford those guys today, and he's actually underpriced considering his production in the first 2 games. So if you have him in your lineup at second base, you have potential for power, you have potential for runs scored, and you're just adding to your toolbox today. We already have guys like Santana, we already have guys like Posey. You're adding Justin Pedroia in there as well. You have a lot of upside without sacrificing any risks in your cash game lineup, which is big to have.
Yeah, and that's that's a good point that Josh is bringing up right there. There are certain positions where there just aren't runs and really produce. At second base, there's probably more than half the guys that are starting at second base who would really struggle to get you 10 points on a normal day. Certain guys like a guy like a Cano, a guy like a Pedroia, even a Zobrist like Josh had mentioned, those guys have a little bit of pop. They can get multiple hits. They're hitting in a part in the order where they're going to drive in some runs, and they got guys behind them who can drive them in if they get on base. Those are the kind of guys that you can get 10, 12, 13, 14 points out of. There's a lot of second basemen who are hitting 7th, 8th, 9th in the order, to get back to what we originally started talking about the importance of where you hit in the order. If you're hitting 7, 8, 9 in the order, you're not going to have as many chances to get driven in. You probably don't have the same kind of pop. If people are going and punting with, basically taking cheap options at second base, and you're able to get 14 or 15 points out of your second baseman while they're only getting 2 or 3 points out of theirs, that's a lot of points that they're going to have to make up at other positions where, there are guys at a lot of the other positions who are cheap and can provide you a lot more pop than a cheap second baseman could. But, there are times when you're going to need to squeeze in a cheap second baseman. Is there anybody that's on your radar there today, Josh?
I actually like a little bit of a risky option today. I know you didn't agree with me before the show when we were talking about some Mets hitters, especially since they've been struggling. But I do like Daniel Murphy today. He hits in the middle of the lineup for that Mets team. He would be very low owned, which is something that we can both talk about to the newer players. Is when a guy is low owned, it means that not a lot of people are on him for that day, whether it be he has a tough matchup, whether it be he's been struggling. What that can do for you in tournament play is if a low owned guy has a home run, if he has 3 or 4 hits, he can bring you right up those leaderboards because not many other people have him, which a lot of people will tell you that's just those are free points. But it also means that not many people have him in that slot, in that second base slot, which means the rest of your lineup relatively is going to be what we call contrarian, which means you're playing those guys in low-owned games. The rest of your lineup is going to be different as well because not a lot of people have Murphy. And I think Murphy is that guy. If he can get the guys in front of him like Lucas Duda on base, Curtis Granderson's hitting leadoff, so we'll have some guys moving around on the bases for him. I like Murphy against Jordan Zimmerman because despite Zimmerman being one of the better pitchers in the National League last year, he gave up a lot of hard hit balls. I'm looking at my sheet here. He gave up 24% of his hit balls were line drives last year. That's a high number, no matter who you are. That's about 5% higher than some of the thresholds we're looking at for guys like Carlos Carrasco, for guys like even Ross Detweiler, who we're not really big fans of today. Zimmerman gave up a lot of those hard hit balls last year, which can translate to a double in the gap, especially for guys like Daniel Murphy. And if you have that 10 points from second baseman and not many other people have, that could do a lot of things for you in tournament play.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a very good point. There's one other guy I want to throw out there too. He's a cheap option if you need a cheap option at second base to make things fit, and that's Jace Peterson of Atlanta. He's been hitting second in that order. He's been getting on base. He's been scoring a couple runs. And the thing that I love the most about him is he's incredibly cheap all over the place. On DraftKings, he's only 3,100, I think, and on FanDuel, I think he's either 22 or 2,400. So if you get yourself into a situation where you need to save some money because there's bats that you really like at other positions, he's a guy that I would not be too upset about taking a flyer on. He's got good lineup placement, and like I said, at the price that he is, I mean, if he gets you one hit and scores a run, or if he steals a base for you as well, he's going to bring you enough value that it's not going to hurt you in your lineups today. So let's move on to shortstop. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of Aaron Harang, and I'm going to be targeting people against him today. So my top option at shortstop today is Hanley Ramirez. Basically, Hanley's a guy who hits right-handed pitching very well, even though he is a righty. I think his splits actually have him hitting right-handers better than he hits left-handers, if I'm not mistaken, last season. But he's a guy in the middle of that order. He's got guys in front of him and behind him who can drive him in, and guys in front of him who he can drive in. And he's got a lot of pop. Again, Aaron Harang's not a guy I'm scared about with strikeouts. I don't think he's going to be blowing the ball by anybody. And again, with all the guys on the Red Sox that he has hitting around him, in front and behind him, I'm expecting him to put up some runs today. And with Hanley right in the middle of that order, I think he's going to be a big part of it.
That's an interesting option because I think with the cheaper players all around the industry today, people are going to be targeting guys like Hanley or Troy Tulowitzki, which you really can't go wrong with either one of them, given the power that both of them have. Hanley just hit a grand slam the other night, two-run home run. But another guy that I'm looking at that not a lot of people might have, this is for if you spend at other positions, you need a cheaper player, is Elvis Andrus against Scott Kazmir. He's one of the more overrated players in terms of what he gets for his contract, but that's a story for another day. But what Andrews can do for you is he has speed, which you get 5 bonus points, I believe it is, on DraftKings for a stolen base. And although Kazmir is a lefty, which baseball people will tell you, a lefty takes away the running game, he has a high leg kick, so he's very slow to the plate. He doesn't slide step a lot, which, whether you're familiar with the game, can really limit the base running. So if Andrews is able to get on first, he'll be running on Scott Kazmir, which will get you 5 bonus points. I think he has 1 stolen base. That's going to take you to value right away. But if you're not going to spend on guys like Tulowitzki, who I really like today, especially against a guy that we talked about earlier with, I believe, Eddie Butler is the guy that's pitching for Colorado, right?
Yep.
Yeah, he hasn't really done too much at all in his baseball career yet because he's only been in the minor league for a few years, and regardless of what those numbers are, everything's different down there. If he's coming up, one of the first hitters he's going to face is Troy Tulowitzki. Could be in for a rude awakening, but that could be good things for your daily fantasy lineup if you can fit him in today.
Yep. So it's shortstop today. Like I said, shortstop's a position today where I don't really like any of the value guys, any of the cheap guys. There might be some options that will open up later on when lineups come out. Shortstop, we're saving money on pitchers. Shortstop's a place today where I think you might want to look at the the guys at the top end. You might want to look to pay up today because that's where you're going to get your points from. So let's move on to third base. There's one guy I want to bring up right away. I want to throw it out there to you, and that's Lamb from Arizona. He's $2,200 right now on FanDuel. On DraftKings, I think he's in the low 3,000s. So far, he came on as a pinch hitter in the first game, had a big base clearing 3 RBI hit, and then last night he jacked out a home run. I know Rath loves this guy. He was telling me, he was singing his praises before the season to me, telling me that this guy's ready for a breakout. If you're looking to save money, because we've given you a lot of options that are expensive at all the other positions. But this is what I was getting at before when I was saying, when you take a guy who's a cheaper player, a guy like Lamb has power. And he's also going to wind up, the way he's been hitting, if I'm the manager, I'm going to wind up keeping him somewhere in the middle of that lineup. So he's going to have some chances to drive in some runs as well. And if you can find a guy who's minimum priced on FanDuel like Lamb is, that has a little bit of power and has the chance to drive in some runs, that's definitely a guy that you got to consider because you can't take studs everywhere. So you got to find a position where you can get a cheap guy. And at third base today, I've been rolling out a lot of Lamb as that cheap guy to allow me to fit in some of the guys that we've already mentioned.
I agree with you completely. He's the guy I'm targeting today at third base. He is that cheap guy that allows you to fit in Posey, allows you to fit in Troy Tulowitzki. But what he can do is that power. We just talked about it. When he's at that level of just 2,200 on FanDuel, that's an incredible price to have a guy that can hit the ball out of the ballpark. pretty much any given at bat. If you look at who he's facing today, is Chris Heston, I believe, is the guy's name for Arizona or for the San Francisco. He hasn't pitched yet in the major leagues other than just 5 innings last year. And in those 5 innings, he gave up 6 hits, 3 walks, and had an ERA of over 10, I believe. So it's a small sample size, but regardless of what happened, that's the first 3 things that we're looking at for a pitcher is what he did in those last games. And for Lamb, he's been on fire. He's seeing the ball well, which a lot of people will tell you that if you're looking at that, sometimes it'll throw you off what the real numbers say. But if you watch Lamb hit, it looks like he's swinging at a beach ball right now.
Yeah, that's, and again, a guy that's that cheap that can give you that kind of upside, he's a guy that I'm going to be using in both cash games and in GPPs because he doesn't need to do a lot to pay himself off for cash, and he does have that pop, he does have that upside for GPPs where, he's one of those guys that's safe to roll out in both if you're looking for a salary saver. Both Josh and I are on him today, but just to give you guys a couple other things to look at, Adrian Beltre is going up against Scott Kazmir. He usually hits left-handed pitching pretty well. So Beltre is another option that you could roll out if you want to spend up a little bit at third base, which I think might be a contrarian thing to do today. Pablo Sandoval is another guy who I've been using a little bit here and there, and that just goes back to basically that I don't like Harang, and I'm going to be targeting him with a lot of the Boston bats. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, if you find a pitcher that you really don't like a lot, there's nothing wrong with taking some of the guys against him and putting a few of them in your lineup. Like we said for yesterday for cash game, if they're expensive options like Sandoval and Pedroia and Hanley Ramirez you really got to choose which ones you want because you don't want to put too many guys in the cash game option that cost a lot of money from the same team. God forbid Harang does come out and go 7 strong innings game lineup by having too much exposure to one team. But let's move on to the outfield for now. There's a lot of options in the outfield today. There's an absolute ton of them. Who are some of the guys that you have your eye on now, Josh?
Like you just said, there's a huge list. I'm looking at mine right here. I have guys like Michael Brantley. I have guys like Curtis Granderson, even as a contrarian play. But one guy I'm really targeting, like you just said, with Aaron Harang, and we hate to keep bringing up Red Sox, but it's a great matchup, is Mookie Betts. He's leading off for that team. He has stolen base upside. He can hit the ball into the gaps for extra base hits. There's many different ways to score fantasy points. And in the cash games, that's something to look at because if he gets on base, he's a threat to score a run. He's a threat to steal a base. And if there's different ways to score, it gives you more of an opportunity, which we always talk about. That's what translates to fantasy point, to score, and that's one of the things that I like to target in cash games, and especially in outfielders. And that brings me to my second guy, is that Michael Brantley against Feldman. We just talked about earlier, Feldman gave up 270 batting average to lefties last year. Brantley had a MVP type season last year. He kind of flew under the radar with what Trout did, with what Cabrera did, despite all of his injuries, what Jose Bautista did, guys like that. But Michael Brantley is one of the better hitters in the game last year. I think he was just under 300. He hit 20 home runs. He stole close to 20 bases. He's hitting in the middle of an order that really gets on base with Carlos Santana. Despite his low batting average, he had high on base percentage. Jason Kipnis is in front of him. You look at guys that they have the opportunity, we just talked about with Betts, to score in different places, and Brantley is one of the higher price guys that can do that for you. I'm putting both of them in my lineups in the outfield today with Mookie Betts and Michael Brantley.
Okay, I like that. I could get on board with that. I am actually looking to target some of the, again, I'm saving in some spots so I can pay up in some other spots, and 2 of the guys who I'm looking to target are left-handed batters facing Willie Peralta for Milwaukee. So I'm basically looking at guys like Dickerson, guys like Blackman, maybe not so much a guy like Morneau, even though he's the other big left-handed bat in there. But Peralta last year had a 305 batting average against the left-handed batters. So basically you're looking at guys that are, that are pretty much in line to get at least 1 hit on the day. And again, the way that lineup's been hitting, they have top to bottom, that lineup is just one guy after another that can really mash the ball. So there's not a lot of not a lot of downside to putting a couple of Rockies in your lineup, even when they are away from Coors Field. But those 2, Dickinson and Blackman, are 2 of the guys that I've really been looking at. Also been looking at and I kind of want to get your thoughts on this guy because he kind of broke out a little bit last year. I'm not a big fan of Shelby Miller, and one of the best matchups I think to target against Shelby Miller today is Christian Yelich. How do you feel about Yelich on the day?
Yelich's another one of those guys. I just talk about those guys that can score in a bunch of different ways. He's hitting, I believe, second, if not leadoff, for that lineup. is he's one of the top players to target in any games where runs will get you those points. And on DraftKings, on FanDuel, he's batting in front of Giancarlo Stanton, who, of course, is one of the better power hitters in the game. He hasn't hit a home run yet, so you know it's coming at some point. If Christian Yelich is on base in front of him, he can steal a bag, which I doubt that will do in front of Stanton, just want to take the bat out of his hands. But if Yelich can get on base maybe once, he's going to have an opportunity to score a run with Stanton behind him. And he has the power to the gaps. He just signed that extension. So you know he's focused down there in Miami. But one of the top things that I like to look at in an outfielder is, we just talked about with Betts, is the ability to score in different ways of the game. And last year, I believe he stole close to 12 bases. I know he was hurt a lot, but if he has the opportunity to get on base in front of Stanton, like we just said, and he's not as expensive as some of the other top outfielders, you're going to be able to save money and still have a top-tier play. And I agree with Benny a lot here. I'm might be putting Yelich into my third outfield slot along with Betts and Brantley.
Yeah, he's a great option. So he's one of those guys that I really like. And basically now we're gonna try to transition over here a little bit. Now we gave you guys some of the players that that we really like. So what we want to do now is kind of go in and talk a little bit to you guys, especially the new players out there, about some game types that you guys, those of you who have been on the Roto Curve site and who have listened to me talk yesterday. One of the things that I think is a big deal, especially for new players, is don't blow your whole load by going into a GPP. You want to play in those 50-50s. You want to play in some of those cash games. This way, you're bringing some money in even when you're not having a great lineup on the day. Another thing that Josh is going to talk about now for you guys, if you're a new player just starting out, and especially if you're on a site like DraftKings that offers them, you really need to be looking at these beginner games. So, Josh, why don't you explain to the people a little bit about what these beginner games are and why they should be playing in some of them?
When you look at DraftKings, especially when you're playing a new sport, when you're first playing for the first time, there are these games for beginners. And I believe it depends on different sports, but I think right now the threshold is at 50 contests. If you're under 50 contests, you can play in these games that are called beginner games that keeps you away from the people that have been playing for a while. You're going to be playing against people that are just starting like yourself, and it gives you more of an edge to kind of build that bankroll for I guess you could say graduating to the rest of the contest. But be sure to take advantage of these contests because these are players that are just joining, just like yourself, and you're going to be seeing guys that are playing not really just for the love of the game, and you might have a little bit of an edge over those guys. You're watching shows like ours, you're studying the statistics, you're learning the trends, learning the patterns. There's actually a higher likelihood for you to cash if you're doing research in those games because some of those newer players are just in there trying it, just playing a dollar here and there. But be sure to take advantage of those beginner games. I know personally I played them. I know Benny played them. I still have some left for PGA and other sports like that. So I'm going to be targeting those games just to kind of learn the sport. It's a new thing. It's always want to be in a position where you can learn and still have fun in the very beginning without blowing your entire bankroll. Those beginner games on DraftKings is huge, and I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of first-time guys will start there. Now, a lot of FanDuel is different, DraftKings is different. There's always different ways to target the different sites. But on DraftKings, if you're starting, I'd highly recommend going over there, playing those beginner games, just learning the game a little bit, and having some fun without completely destroying your bankroll and giving up head-to-heads against some of the top players in the industry.
Yep. So we're coming up to the hour right now, so we're almost done here. So Josh, before we leave, why don't you give the people give them a little idea of which way you're going to be leaning tonight, what guys you're targeting, how you think your lineup constructions are going to go.
I'm going to definitely be building around Carlos Santana. I think he's one of the keys to having a nice little lineup tonight. Of course, we talk about with the pitching, but right now I'm going to be probably targeting more Carrasco and then having him and Santana start a mini Indian stack. Between those two guys, you're only sacrificing about $1,300 or $13,000 on DraftKings and probably about $9,000 total on FanDuel. So I'm going to start with those two guys. I've been sold on what Dustin Pedroia has been doing. He's probably going to be rounding out my guy at second base. You need a cheap guy in there, which we talked about, and I don't think you got to look any farther than Jake Lamb. In addition to that, I think if you're going to be playing tonight with a whole bunch of different games, you're going to want to be making more than one lineup. So maybe mix it up a little bit with some pitchers. Maybe put some Tulowitzki in one lineup, and if you're making another lineup just for like a cheap game or something, maybe going with Hanley. Of course, Benny spoke a lot about him earlier. So if you're going to mix it up a little bit, don't put exactly the same guys in both. That's a different target for another day called multi-entry, which we'll explain more on a different show. But if you're looking at different kinds of pitchers, I know last night if you had Latos, he pretty much ended your night. So if you're going to be making more than one lineup, you might want to stay away from the same exact pitchers, because if one blows up, your night's over and you got to put on QVC or the History Channel or something. You're not watching sports for the rest of the night. But Benny, I'm going to be building around Santana, Carlos Carrasco, and probably Brandon McCarthy. What are you looking at for your core?
Yeah, I mean, to agree with you right off the bat, I mean, Carrasco's a guy that I have in a lot of my lineups already. I have him as on single pitcher sites. I have him on FanDuel. I have him over on. I play a lot on Aces and DraftKings as well. He's a guy that I have on both of those sites as well. He's not in all my lineups. I don't ever put somebody in all my lineups if I make more than one lineup. But he's in the majority of them. I mean, he's definitely one of the guys I'm building around today. Like I said, as far as hitters go, I'm a big fan of the Red Sox today. I think they're going to knock around Harang, put some points up on the board. They're also kind of expensive, so they're not easy to fit in. So if you are going to go with, some of the guys in the Red Sox, some of the guys in the Rockies today, you are going to need guys like a Jake Lamb, like a Yelich, who's a little bit cheaper. You might even, like I was saying before, I might even wind up using a guy like Peterson from Atlanta at second base instead of Pedroia if I run out of money, because I do like Posey, I do like Adrian Gonzalez. I mean, those guys are in good spots. They're they've been producing. They're in a good heart of the order where they're, there's a lot of upside for them. There's a lot of chances for them to get RBIs, a lot of chances for them to score runs of their own, and they're guys who I think should be on base a couple times today. So, I haven't built too many of my teams out already. I pretty much have half teams right now, where I plugged in a lot of these guys that I want, and I got to go out and round them out. So, especially in your cash games, the big thing about the cash games, if you want all these studs, you got to find a couple cheap guys. To bring the show full circle, like we said earlier, you can find some of those cheap bats hitting up in the order. That San Francisco game is scheduled to have a lot of runs scored in it. David Peralta is another cheap guy in the outfield who's going to be batting somewhere in the middle of that order again today. Those are the kind of guys that you're going to have to need to fit in with some of those studs, in order to make it work. It's a little bit easier today because pitching isn't as expensive. We don't have a lot of aces on the mound. I think some of the highest priced pitchers today, are right around, they're barely over $10,000 on both sites. So, there are some options to go today. But like I said, Carrasco is the big thing for me on the mound. He's a guy that I'm going to have everywhere. I really like Hanley Ramirez at shortstop. Really like Buster Posey. Really like Adrian Gonzalez. I'm going to have to probably take one or two of these guys down because I'm not going to be able to fit them all in. But that's basically the way that I've been looking for tonight. So we're running right up to the 1 o'clock hour here right now. For those of you who are here, we thank you for joining us. We will be back Friday, April 10th at 12 noon for the next installment of The Curve. Be sure to check out rotocurve.com and see some of the forums, some of the posts that are in there. Feel free to reach out to Josh and I on Twitter. Again, my Twitter handle is BennyR11, BENNYR11. Josh, you want to give the people yours?
Yeah, I'm at Josh Kalachi. It's Josh, and then you can see the bottom. My name right here is Kalachi. There's a whole bunch of C's, a bunch of L's, some A's. Just put it all together. They'll end up putting it in B-Flow. And you can find both of us. You can also target the RotoCurve Twitter handle, which is at RotoCurve, and we'll be sure to answer your questions up to lock. And good luck, everybody, tonight. We will see you on Friday. I believe Benny has one more thing he wants to say.
That's right. I'm Benny Ricciardi, and for my partner Josh Calaccio, we're going to be signing off. Thank you for joining us here on The Curve, and stay classy, DFS. Have a good one.